The Rainbow Magic Treasury. Chapter 3. Saffron, the Yellow Fairy. Over here, Kirsty, Rachel called. She and Kirsty were running across the emerald green fields on Rainspell Island. Buttercups and daisies dotted the grass. Don't go too far, Kirsty's mum called. Kirsty caught up with a friend. Rachel was standing on the bank in the rippled stream. What have you found, Rachel? Is it another fairy? I'm not sure, said Rachel. I thought I heard something. Kirsty's face lit up. Maybe there's a fairy in the stream. Rachel knelt down and put her ear close to the water. Kirsty crouched down too and listened hard. The sun glittering over the water as it splashed over the big shiny pebbles. Then they heard a tiny bubbling voice. Follow me, it gurgled. Follow me. Did you hear that? Rachel gasped. Yes, said Kirsty, her eyes wide. It must be a magic stream. Maybe the stream will lead us to the yellow fairy, said Rachel. Kirsty's parents had stopped to admire the stream too. Which way now? Asked Mr. Tate. Let's go this way, Kirsty said, pointing along the bank. A kingfisher flew from a twig. Butterflies as bright as jewels fluttered around amongst the reeds. Everything on Rainspell Island was so beautiful, said Kirsty's mum. I'm glad we still have 5 days of our holiday left. Yes, Rachel thought, and 5 rainbow fairies still to find. Ruby, the red fairy, and Amber, the orange fairy, were already safe at the pot of the end of the rainbow. The girls ran on ahead. As they followed the stream, the sun went behind the big dark cloud. A chilly breeze ruffled the girls' hair. Kirsty saw that some of the leaves on the trees were turning brown, even though it wasn't autumn. It looks like Jack Frost's goblins are still around, she warned Rachel. I know, Rachel shivered. They'll do anything to stop the rainbow fairies getting back to fairyland. The stream ran through a meadow. A herd of black and white cows were grazing at the water's edge. Aren't they lovely? Kirsty said. Suddenly the cows ran off towards the other end of the field. Rachel and Kirsty looked at each other in surprise. What was going on? There was a loud buzzing noise. A small, angry shape came whizzing through the air straight towards them. Rachel almost jumped out of her skin. It's a bee! Run! Kirsty cried. Rachel tore through the meadow with Kirsty beside her, their feet pounding the grass. Keep running, girls, called Mr. Tate, catching up with them. That bee seems to be following us. Rachel glanced back. The bee was bigger than any other bee she'd ever seen. In here, quick, Mrs. Tate called from the side of the field, and pulled up the open gate. They rolled round along and then stopped to get their breath. I wonder who lives there, Kirsty said, looking around. They were in a beautiful garden. A path led up to the thatched cottage with yellow roses around the door. Just then a very strange creature came out from behind some trees. It looked like an alien from outer space. Oh, Rachel and Kirsty gasped. The creature lifted its gloved hands and removed its white helmet to reveal an old lady. Sorry if I startled you, she said, smiling. I do look a bit strange in my beekeeper suit. Rachel sighed in relief. It wasn't a space alien after all. I'm Mrs. Merry, the old lady went on. Hello, Rachel said. I'm Rachel. This is my friend Kirsty. And this is my mum and dad, Kirsty added. Mr. and Mrs. Tate greeted Mrs. Merry. Mr. Tate ducked into a huge bee zoomed past his ear. Watch out, he said. Oh, there's Hiveless Queen again, said Mrs. Merry. She flapped her hand at the bee. Go on, shoot. Rachel watched as it swooped over the hedge and disappeared. Why did the bee chase us? Kirsty asked. I don't think she was chasing you, said Mrs. Merry. She looked like she was just heading this way because she was looking for a hive of her own. But all the hives have already had queens. Since you're here, would you like to try some of my honey? She asked. Yes, please, said Rachel. They followed Mrs. Merry across the lawn to the table covered with rows of jars. Each jar was filled with rich golden honey. Dappling sunlight danced over the jars, making the honey glow. Here you are, said Mrs. Merry, spooning some honey into the pretty plate. Thank you, Rachel said. She dipped her finger in a little ball of honey and popped it into her mouth. The honey was the most delicious she'd ever tasted. She felt it begin to tingle on her tongue. It tastes all fuzzy, she said. Kirsty dipped her finger in the honey too. Look, she said. Rachel saw the honey was sparkling with thousands of tiny gold lights. She grabbed Kirsty's arm. Do you think this means? Yes, said Kirsty. Her eyes were shining. Another rainbow fairy must be nearby. We have to find out where the honey came from, Rachel said. Yes, Kirsty agreed. Mum, can we stay here a bit longer, please? As long as it's okay with Mrs. Merry, Kirsty's mum replied. Mrs. Mary beamed. Of course they can stay, she said. Mr. and Mrs. Tate decided to carry on with their walk, making sure you come back by lunchtime, Kirsty's mum said. We will, Kirsty promised. Come along then, girls, Mrs. Mary set off across the lawn. Rachel and Kirsty followed her down the garden. 6 wooden hives stood underneath some apple trees. Which one did the honey come from? We tasted, Kirsty asked. Mrs. Mary looked very pleased. Did you enjoy it? The honey from the hive tastes especially good at the moment. I think we might know why, Rachel whispered to Kirsty. Yes, Kirsty agreed. It could be fairy honey. That's the one, Mrs. Mary said, pointing at the bottom of the garden. One hive stood all alone, beneath the biggest apple tree. As they drew nearer to the hive, the sleepy, buzzy sound drifted into the air. The bees in this hive are very peaceful, said Mrs. Mary. I've never known them to be so happy. Can we get a bit closer, Rachel asked. I think it's safe with the bees so quiet, Mrs. Mary decided. But you had better wear a hood, just in case. She went to a shed and brought out 2 beekeepers' hoods. Here you are, she said. Rachel and Kirsty pulled over their hoods. It was a bit stuffy inside, but they could see out of the fine netting. They moved closer to the hive. The soft buzzing surrounded them almost like music. We needn't open it and have a look, Kirsty whispered to Rachel. Rachel nodded, but they couldn't start searching for the yellow fairy with Mrs. Mary there. Kirsty had an idea. Could I have a drink of water, please? She asked. Of course you can, dear, said Mrs. Mary, and she went off towards the cottage. Quick, Kirsty spun around. Let's open the hive. Rachel grasped one side of the lid, and she took hold of the other side. It slowly came loose with strings of golden honey streaking down. Watch out, it's very sticky, Rachel said. The girls laid the heavy lid carefully on the ground. Kirsty wiped her fingers on the grass. Look, Rachel whispered. Kirsty turned to see and gasped. A shower of sparkly gold dust shot up from the hive, shimmering and dancing in the sunlight. Fairy dust. Rachel peered down in the hive. A tiny girl was sitting cross-legged on a piece of honeycomb in the middle of the sea of honey. A bee lay with his head on her lap while she combed his silky hair. Several other bees were waiting their turn, buzzing gently. Oh, Kirsty, Rachel whispered, we found another rainbow fairy. The fairy had bright yellow hair, and she wore a necklace of golden raindrops around her neck and sparkly gold bracelets on her wrist. Her bright yellow t-shirt and shorts were the colour of buttercups. Thank you for finding me, the fairy called up to them. I'm Saffron, the yellow fairy. I'm Rachel, said Rachel. And I'm Kirsty, said Kirsty. We've met 2 of your sisters already, Ruby and Amber. Saffron beamed. You found Ruby and Amber? She stood up, gently pushing the bee away. Yes, they're safe at the pot at the end of the rainbow, under the willow tree, Rachel said. Saffron clapped her tiny hands. I can't wait to see them again. Suddenly she looked worried. Have you seen any of Jack Frost's goblins nearby? Not here, Kirsty said, but there are some that popped yesterday. Goblins are scary, Saffron said with a trembling voice. I've been safe from them with my friends the bees. That's all right, to Rachel. King Oberon sent one of his frog footmen to look after you and your sisters. Saffron looked more cheerful. A large bee crawled from one waxy opening in the honeycomb to next to Saffron. This is my best friend, Queenie, said Saffron. She put her arms around the bee's neck and kissed the top of the fairy head. Queenie buzzed softly. Say hello, said Saffron. Hello, Queenie, said Kirsty and Rachel. Saffron picked up a tiny comb and began to comb Queenie's shiny hair. Another bee buzzed crossly. Don't worry, Petal, I'll comb your hair next, Saffron said. Rachel and Kirsty looked at each other in dismay. Why wasn't Saffron flying out of the hive? What if Saffron wants to stay with Queenie and the other bees, Kirsty whispered. Saffron, you have to come with us, Rachel burst out. Or Fairyland will never get its colours back, Kirsty added. It will take all of Rainbow Sisters to undo his spell. Yes, of course, we have to break Jack Frost's spell, Saffron cried. She suddenly jumped to her feet and picked up her wand. There was an icy wind that sprung up, and something crunched under Kirsty's feet. The grass was covered in frost. Rachel shivered in something soft and cold brushing against her cheek. A snowflake in the summer? What's happening? She cried. Jack Frost's goblins must be near, Kirsty said. Saffron's tiny teeth chattered. Oh no, if they find me they will stop me getting back to Fairyland. Kirsty looked at Rachel in alarm. Quick, we must go. Rachel leaned down and carefully lifted the fairy out of the hive. Saffron's golden hair dripped with honey. Oh dear, you are really sticky, Rachel said. Just then Kirsty spotted Mrs. Mary coming out of her cottage. Rachel popped the fairy into a pocket of her shorts. Hey, it's dark in here, Saffron complained. Sorry, Rachel whispered. I'll get you out again in a minute. Suddenly Kirsty noticed the open hive. We'll have to put the top back on. Rachel helped her lift it as they put it back just as Miss Mary came through the trees. "Here's your drink, dear," said Mrs. Mary, holding out a glass to Kirsty. She had taken off her strange suit, and on the other hand was carrying a shopping basket. "Thank you very much," Kirsty said. "Now, you girls stay as long as you like," said Mrs. Mary. "I just remembered I must go and buy some fish for my cat." Rachel watched as the old lady go towards the garden gate. Then she slipped her hand into her pocket. "You can come out now," she said to Saffron. The fairy was covered with grey fluff in Rachel's pocket. "Achoo!" she sneezed. She brushed crossly the bits of fluff clinging to her wings. "I won't be able to fly," she wailed. "We need to clean you up," Rachel said, "but we'll have to be quick, in case the goblins find us." Kirsty spotted a bird bath filled with clean water. "We could use that." Just what we need," Rachel agreed. She carried Saffron over to the bird bath. Saffron fluttered on the edge of the bath, put down her wand and dived in. Splash! The water fizzed and turned bright yellow. Lemony smelling drops shot everywhere. Sparkling clean, Saffron zoomed up into the air to dry. "That's better," she cried. Her wings flashed like gold in the sun, and she swooped onto Rachel's shoulder. "Goodbye, Queenie," Saffron called. Queenie looked out at the entrance of the hive. Her feelers drooped sadly as she waved one tiny leg and buzzed goodbye. As they headed towards the wood, Saffron gave a cry and flew up into the air. "Oh no," she gasped, "I left my wand inside the bird bath." Rachel looked at Kirsty in dismay. "I'll have to go back," she said. "Yes," Kirsty agreed. "We can't leave a fairy wand lying about. It would be terrible if the goblins found it." Oh dear," Saffron murmured. She fluttered anxiously above them as they went back along the path. Rachel paused at the gate. There was no sign of any goblins. They ran through the apple trees, straight to the Queenie's hive. Suddenly an icy blast made them shiver. They gazed around in alarm. Icicles hugged the apple trees and the lawn and the white with the frost. The goblins had arrived. Saffron gave a cry of horror. An ugly, hook-nosed goblin jumped on top of Queenie's hive. He was holding Saffron's wand. "Give me back my wand," Saffron demanded. "Come and get it," yelled the goblin. He leaped off the hive and ran towards the garden gate. Kirsty gasped as another goblin jumped down from the apple tree. Splat! He landed on the frosty grass and set off to run. "Catch!" The goblin threw the wand to his friend. It flew in the air and shot out yellow sparkles. The other goblin reached and caught the wand. "Got it!" Just then Queenie flew out of the hive. All the other bees swarmed behind her in a noisy cloud. With Queenie in the lead, the bees formed an arrow shape and surged after the goblins. "Be careful, Queenie," pleaded Saffron. The goblin shook Saffron's wand at Queenie. "Go away!" More yellow sparkles shot out the wand. One of the sparks hit Queenie's wing. Queenie wobbled mid-air. She then buzzed and flew at the goblin again. "Help!" The goblin ducked and dropped her wand. "Butterfingers," grumbled the other goblin, scooping it up. "They're getting away," Kirsty said in dismay. "No, they're not," Rachel cried. The cloud of bees shot across the garden, and the goblin disappeared under an angry black cloud. "Get off me," spluttered the goblin with a wand. He tried to brush the bees away, but tripped over his feet, and as he fell he bumped into the other goblin and tumbled in a big heap, dropping the wand on the grass. "That was your fault," complained one of the goblins. "No, it wasn't," snapped the other one. Queenie zoomed over and picked up the wand. She carried it to Saffron, who was standing on Rachel's hand. Saffron took her wand from Queenie and waved it in the air. A fountain of fluttering yellow butterflies sparkled around them. "My wand is all right," Saffron cried joyfully. "Look, the goblins are going," Kirsty said. The bees had chased the goblins at the end of the garden, still arguing. They ran across the fields. As their grumbling voices faded away, the icy wind dropped, and the sun shone warmly and the frost melted. The bees streamed back and flew around Rachel and Kirsty, buzzing softly. "Thank you, Queenie," Saffron hugged her friend. Suddenly Queenie wobbled and tipped sideways. Rachel cupped her hands, worried that Queenie would roll off. "She might be hurt," she said. Saffron knelt down and looked closely at Queenie. "Oh no," she gasped, "she's torn her wing." "Can you mend Queenie's wing with magic?" Kirsty added. Saffron shook her head. "Not on my own, but Amber or Ruby might be able to help with me. We must take Queenie to the pot at the end of the rainbow." Rachel and Kirsty hurried into the woods. Saffron flew behind them, her rainbow-coloured wings shimmering. Kirsty went over and parted the branch of the willow tree. Its large green frog hopped out from behind the black pot. "Bertram!" Saffron flew down and hugged him. "I'm so glad you're here." Bertram bowed. "Hello, Miss Saffron, Miss Ruby and Miss Amber. We'll be delighted to see you." Suddenly a shower of red and orange fairy dust shot up from the pot, followed by Ruby and Amber. "Saffron!" Ruby shouted. "It's good to have you back," Amber called happily, doing a backflip. The air around the fairies fizzed with red flowers, orange bubbles, and yellow butterflies. Ruby flew on Kirsty's shoulder. "Thank you, Rachel and Kirsty," she said. She spotted Queenie sitting on Rachel's hand. "Who is this?" "This is Queenie," Saffron explained. "She helped me get my wand back, but one of the goblins hurt her wing. Can you help?" Amber frowned. "I could mend Queenie's wing if I had a fairy needle and thread," she said, "but I don't have any on here on the island." Rachel remembered something. "Kirsty, what about the magic bags that the fairy queen gave us?" Kirsty took out the bag. When she opened, a cloud of glitter shot up into the air. "There's something inside," Kirsty said. She drew out a tiny shiny needle, thread with fine spider silk, and she held it out to Amber. "Perfect," Amber said. She carefully wove the needle in and out of the tear. A row of stitches glowed like tiny silver dots. Queenie buzzed softly and flapped her wings, and then she zoomed into the air. Her wings were as good as new. "You have been such a good friend to Saffron. You must stay with us," said Amber, flying up and hugged the bee. "Yes," Ruby agreed. "Please come and live with us in the pot." Queenie flew down and buzzed to Saffron's ear. "She says she would love to," said Saffron. "There is a hiveless queen in Mrs. Mary's garden who will take care of her bees." Then her face fell. "But what about our sisters? They're still trapped." "Don't worry," Kirsty said. "We'll find them soon." "Yes, we will," Rachel agreed. "Nothing will stop us finding all of the rainbow fairies."